Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm your host, Deb Philman. At The Reason We Learn, we aspire to be part of the solution. The purpose of this show is to take a good, honest, potentially painful look at the way kids are being educated. We know we can do better, and this is where we'll talk about how. Let's learn something. Hey, everyone. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm your host, Deb Philman. I'm very excited to bring you a great guest today, Will Reilly. And we are going to be talking about the 70th anniversary of Brown v. Board of Education and the racial achievement gap, the meaning of statistics in that regard, and so on. Lots to talk about. Before we get started today, and I tell you a little more about Will, please go ahead and hit that like button. And if you're not already a subscriber to this channel, please consider subscribing. And you will be notified when I make new content about education. This is where I talk about all things related to education, K-12 and higher education. So if you're interested in that, please tell your friends. I also have a community at wokescreen.com/The Reason We Learn, where I do private content and I host a parent support group at The Reason We Parent. So if that is of interest to you, please check it out. The information is below in the description box. So today's guest, Wilfred Reilly, is an associate professor of political science at Kentucky State University and the author of the books Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About, Hate Crime Hoax, and the $50 Million Question. He is currently working on an upcoming project, Alt Wrongs, an American Case Against Racial Nationalism, as well as sketching out a book looking at the transgender, gender fluid, and otherkin communities and the idea of a flexible identity. Reilly has published pieces in Academic Questions, Commentary, Quillette, and a number of other journals and magazines. His research interests include international relations and the prevention of war, contemporary American race relations, and the use of modern quantitative methods to test sacred cow theories, such as the existence of widespread white privilege. And that is why I have invited him here today. I follow him on Twitter. As I keep telling you guys, I'm going to keep dead naming it. Sorry. That's how it goes. And I am always interested to see his takes on the sacred cow issues. And today's is no exception. We're talking about that racial achievement gap. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Wilfred Reilly. Hi there.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing
All
pretty
right.
well.
Good. Glad to hear it. So as I just said, you're sort of my go-to guy for statistics, in part because you are willing to say things that other people don't necessarily want to hear if the math adds up. And I do my level best to tell the truth here. May get it wrong, but I am trying. So I came across something on Twitter the other day from a guy named Scott Davison. I'm going to bring it up and show it to everyone because I was taken aback. We are at the 70th anniversary of Brown v. Board. And this is, I'm going to try to see if we can look at just what he's saying. But unfortunately, Val is there for all the world to see. Okay. So there we go. Okay. So here it is. Friday marked the 70th anniversary of Brown v. Board of Education, the landmark Supreme Court case, which ended racial segregation in schools. 70 years later, racial segregation is back. And then he says, by white supremacists, nope, the Department of Education in the state of California. And this is a 12-post thread. So the first, and he's in California. My local California school board just approved a policy stating that they believe that students benefit when district staff reflects the racial, ethnic, linguistic, and cultural diversity of the district. And this is the policy. See, it actually says that literally. Diversity of the district implies that school staff should match the racial and ethnic profiles of the district, i.e. if 40% of students are Black, 40% of teachers should be Black. And then he goes on to say the policy requires the superintendent to seek to establish and maintain a diverse staff through the recruitment and selection processes. And that is illegal, as he points out, because of the Civil Rights Act. And when a vacancy occurs, it says the superintendent or designee shall review as appropriate the job description for the position to ensure it accurately describes the major functions and duties of the position. The superintendent or designee shall also disseminate job announcements to a wide range of candidates, but they want to prefer the racial makeup of the school. So as I'm going through this, does anything jump out at you as being I don't know, legitimate, illegitimate about this, leaving aside the unconstitutional nature of it, just from the standpoint of the claim that the students do better when they're in a
Yeah, I mean, so
classroom?
I think there are two things there. I mean, first of all, like I trained as a lawyer. I'm not a practicing lawyer, but I trained as a lawyer at the University of Illinois. I mean, I still have a fair amount of that knowledge. I'm probably taking the Kentucky bar here pretty soon. And I mean that's flamboyantly illegal, as far as I can tell. I mean, you already know this at least as well as I do, but there are a number of. I mean, this goes back to the Constitution, the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. Everyone, when you're talking about something like the application process for a major job, entry quals for a profession, needs to be treated essentially equally without regard to race, ethnicity. I mean, at that level, they're still talking about former condition of servitude, having been a slave, having fought on the other side, this kind of thing. That's supplemented extensively by the Civil Rights Act. You
Right.
can't, unless there's an absolute necessity, blah, 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 but discriminate based on race, sex, religion. I mean, so my facial impression of policies like this is that they're obviously illegal and unconstitutional.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm amazed that whites, especially white men, don't just sue more. I mean, several kind of conservative Caucasian wits recently, Jeremy Carl, Richard Hanania, Dick Hanania, have just sort of pointed this out that a great deal of wokeness, with all due respect to my good personal buddy James Lindsay, but it is not really what we're talking about here. Isn't interpretations of the theoretical Foucault or something like that. There's a policy that says that we've probably both encountered in executive roles. You can be sued if you don't have a roughly proportional workforce defined as about 80% representation of each major ethnic group on your trading floor or whatever relative to the proportions of the same groups in the surrounding community. So that's actually the kind of thing that we're talking about. And you're starting to see more challenges against this. And that's, I think, really where the battle is going to be won in strategic terms. Like, will the Supreme Court say something about policies of this kind? But I think the question you're asking me, rather than kind of legal analysis from 8 years ago, is there evidence that teachers do better with or students do better with exactly proportional sort of same race um, educational faculties? Not really. I mean, there's actually a pretty substantial literature on diversity. And I may be a little rusty on some of this. I haven't reviewed or written an academic paper on this for several years, but
Mhm.
what they basically find is that what we think of as population diversity is a slight advantage, i.e., you see a higher patent rate in diverse societies. Or, I mean, there really is that piece from McKinsey, although it's currently being challenged, that
Mhm.
companies that display a certain percentage of women among the senior executive team tend to move product to market a little bit better. And I think there's some obvious reasons that could be true. But there are two qualifications for that. One, the effect of diversity only applies if everyone's equally qualified. So that's specifically not the case in large boost affirmative action situations. And two, the effect of diversity, the positive effect of diversity, only applies where people don't dislike each other and they interact well. No one would ever argue that diversity helped Yugoslavian business or Rwandan business or something like that. So, in practice, what you said, that's an effect of diversity, by the way, not exact proportionality. So, short version, no, there aren't really any studies that show that kids learn dramatically better with same race teachers. There's some that find a 1 or 2% positive impact. So
Mhm.
there's a bunch of literature that tries to find subtle biases that white teachers have against black students. But increasingly these are getting more and more subtle to the point of being barely detectable. And you also have to look at the fact that white teachers on average tend to be more qualified. They tend to have cleared the boards by more points. They tend to have more years of experience in the classroom, so on down the line. So when you adjust for all of that, I mean, no, the Catholic schools traditionally in Chicago and New York, with mostly perhaps Irish American, educational faculties, they didn't do a bad job with their students. I don't think there's any evidence that just bringing in a proportional number of minority teachers, given
Mhm.
how we're currently performing on the tests, would be a plus.
Okay. So, now what would you say to the people who would argue that we now have, you mentioned they should like each other. We're now having problems with classroom management. We're seeing a lot of teachers leaving the profession because the classes are just unruly and they're acting out. And we're even seeing, in anecdotes here and there, videos online, students attacking teachers. And it's not always, black students attacking white teachers. I mean, it runs the gamut. But what would you say to those who say the students might be less likely? There's so much animus, let's say, since George Floyd and since the whole DEI thing has been talked up and all this conversation about race and white supremacy, that a white teacher going into a predominantly, it's like brown classroom, in California has a lot of Hispanic students too, might face more animosity and there might be more tension than a similar a teacher of a similar ethnicity or race. And again, I'm sort of just throwing out different arguments that people might make to try to legitimize it.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that there are a couple of responses there. So first, I mean, I think your question, and obviously it's a setup question, but
Sure.
indicates how far we've come from common sense with a lot of this.
Right.
So I mean, one of the things I do at K-State is volunteer to teach in high schools in the surrounding community from time to time. We have a course called Political Science 101 that's just basic American government. And I like doing that with a high school audience. And these are technically, I suppose, both inner city and Appalachian schools. Now, that's a wild exaggeration of how bad the schools are, but these would be in downtown Frankfurt or in Louisville. I've got pretty diverse student bodies. And I suppose if I had a class that was composed mostly of poor whites, they might greet me with more animosity initially. But I mean, the reaction of a functional school, which all of these are to that, is complete intolerance for the students. I mean, so if you have students that are harassing a teacher for racial reasons, I mean, you suspend two of them for a week and then that stops.
Right.
So, I mean, it's a simple fact that a lot of teachers are white women, which I think is honorable. That's like saying a lot of firemen are white and black men. Like, no one should have a problem with that. There shouldn't be a big debate between men and women about why we keep risking our lives, you know? It's the same thing here. I mean, if white women happen to be the group that's very willing to get in the classroom and help educate young people, that should be in general respected. So if the argument is, well, we can't put those white broads in there because the students will abuse them, I mean, that's the kind of stuff actual domestic abusers say. I mean, no, you have
Yeah.
to simply punish the students that are screaming at the teacher. And that's extremely easy to do. And I think this gets into the point, by the way, that there are multiple issues in the schools that go well beyond diversity. The biggest issue in every urban school I've ever taught in, whether that's poor whites in Kentucky, blacks and Hispanics in Chicago, I taught in the Chicago City colleges for a while. I mean, one of them is called Malcolm X College, just to give you an illustration of that kind of
Yeah.
student population. I
Right.
mean, biggest in great kids, but I mean, tough kids. The biggest problem in every urban inner city educational environment I've ever been in is discipline. I mean, if you have one guy who's on the football team and likes goofing around, not even necessarily a thug, that guy can disrupt a class of 30 people every second day to the point where no one learns anything. So, I
Right.
mean, you have to be able to do things like, I mean, I'm a reasonably sized guy, a big bald, reasonably tough and kind of goofy looking dude. I mean, like, I'll just tell people, like, get out. You're gone, son. And no one really disputes my presence in the classroom in that way. And we
Right.
resolve the situation that way. We can talk about it later. But I don't think you should necessarily expect young female teachers to have to do that. You need to have rules set up so that you have order. That's a far bigger problem in the school than what the race of the teacher is. So I don't view the question, would racist students harass a young female teacher, as a justification for firing teachers that are in a certain clade. That's a crazy thing for a boss to say.
Right. And
Um,
of course it is a setup question, but I bring it up in part because I have seen there is a website out there, if it still exists. I think it was called Teaching While White. And it was one of the arguments that these white teachers and this Teaching While White website were making was sort of like, well, we need to not be in the classroom with black students because they hate us and that's their right to hate us because we're hateable. And I mean, I'm reading this like, as you pointed out, how far have we come where we actually have the teachers, saying they're right to hate us. It's
no,
like
that's
we should leave.
no, that's the way abuse victims talk. And I mean, I hear this especially from whites, but really often on both sides of the racial debate.
Right.
The bros and feminists online have almost gotten to this level as well, where people hear so much insane commentary that they
Right.
begin to view the insanity as a norm. And if you get
Exactly.
online and you talk to actual Black business people or white educators or normal men with jobs or normal women, you find none of this kind of toxic content. And then you begin to realize, oh, the initial human impressions that I had about Blacks or whites or whatever as a group were quite correct. So, no, I mean, I've taught in a bunch of functional Black schools, functional poor white schools. No, that stuff's not allowed. Perhaps we're out here in the hinterland, cities of only 3 million people and so on, virtually living with your farm animals. But I mean, like, in all honesty, there's a bit of absurdity to saying, well, downtown Louisville is so different from downtown Chicago that those techniques wouldn't work there. I don't understand that. I've
No,
spent
I
a lot of
think
time
you're
teaching
right. I
about.
think it's a matter of will. You have to have the guts to just do it. And what I'm seeing is
Sure.
a lot of administrators who aren't. But getting back to the original impetus for this is the so-called racial achievement gap.
Sure.
So, why would we even be having this conversation? Why even, discuss whether there should be more Black teachers, fewer Black teachers, whatever? It's that they're looking at gaps in achievement, which were getting better, it seemed, and then apparently are, stalling or getting worse, or the improvements are not holding. And so this is one of their proposed solutions apparently, and like I said, they've gone all the way to writing policy, so they're obviously pretty attached to it. So I went and I found, there's a uh there's a group called the Hechinger Report, and I'm not too familiar with it, but I know that it's one of the things one of the things, their primary focus is about, closing gaps, inequality in education. So I take it as a given that there's a little bit of bias because they accept the premise that there is inequality, there's some kind of structural inequality in education. And I mean, I'm guessing because otherwise, why would we be talking about it as we have a whole report given over to inequality in education? But then we get into, it says it's a national nonprofit, newsroom reports on one topic, education, et cetera. And they talk about Brown v. Board. And here we say two sociologists, Sean Reardon at Stanford University and Ann Owens at the University of Southern California, have teamed up to analyze both historical and recent trends. Reardon and Owens were slated to present their analysis at Stanford University Conference on May 6th, and they shared the presentation with me in advance. They also expect to launch a new website to display segregation trends for individual school districts around the country. Here are 5 takeaways from their work. The long view shows progress, but a worrying uptick, especially in big cities. Now they're speaking about white-Black segregation. What is your analysis of what is described often as segregation? But what I've always looked at is people living in different places. And yeah, I mean, in other words, when I hear the word segregation, I'm thinking of de jure kind of segregation, not just people like to live in neighborhoods with certain people, or this is where they can afford to live. And, it feels like there's a value judgment attached to the word segregation. Am I crazy?
No, I mean, so I think again, and obviously, like, because we're talking about the biases of Hechinger, which is a perfectly respectable group. Like, I have a center right bias myself. I mean, I come from kind of the business world originally,
Right.
and I think a lot of this stuff is that I hear on the left is just whingy excuse making. I'm sure that's not always correct, but that's the perspective I'm coming from. I don't think that most of the gaps in education have much of anything to do with diversity or segregation. So, I mean, again, there are a lot of very functional Black and certainly minority more broadly, if you throw in Asian American, Latino, Cuban, perhaps Jewish communities into that mix. And if you look across them, you see a range of patterns that are very hard to explain using racism as a causal variable. For example, Asians and Black immigrants almost always outperform whites. The best educated group in the country is Nigerians. Nigerians, I don't think, do any better than whites on the IQ tests, the actual WISC, and so on, but Asians certainly do. Whites tested about 102 right now at mean. Blacks, by the way, are well over 90. So, I mean, these aren't inflexible scores. But Asians are at 108, I think, when Charles Murray looked at this, actually combined the NAEP and looked the other national data and broke down what those scores would mean on an actual IQ scale. So I mean, racism is not the reason. There's no possible way that any breakdown of a claim like white supremacy affects different people differently can explain Nigerians outperforming whites.
Right.
That's just simply not the case. I mean, And what you've seen is a lot of very dishonest attempts by activists on the kind of the center left on left to just sort of pretend that Asians and West Africans are broadly seen as white. And this is not true, but it's a claim that's made very frequently. So the Asians and very often the West African blacks will be stripped out of the data we're looking at, and that will then be used to generate test score figures, or for, I would
Right.
suspect these segregation figures. I read this article, but I didn't read the data sources for it in depth. But I
Right.
mean, similarly, like last sentence on this before I get into the segregation point, but I mean, the same thing with the race of teachers. I mean, I would say that having a same race teacher might have a slight positive effect. I think I did say that, but that assumes equal qualifications.
Right.
Right now, we just don't have equal qualifications. I pulled up some recent SAT data while we were talking. I mean, average score for Asians is 1223. Whites aren't doing all that great, actually. Certainly, if you throw in the West Virginias and so on, but still, average score over 1100 is quite respectable. But I mean, average score for blacks 950, Hispanics 970, natives 912. I mean, so when you say something like, well, we don't have a lot of native teachers even on the reservation, Native Americans make up 2% of the population and have an average SAT score of 900. Now, all the respect in the world for that group, which were the original holders of the land and so on, but that's the reason for that. So if you take the teacher with a 900 SAT and you put them in the classroom and you're booting out a teacher with an 1150 to do that, that's not going to improve education for students. And in practice, that's what you're doing. I
Y
mean,
yeah, that's and I mean, so I see words like a worrying uptick, and I all I can think is, why worrying? So is there something arbitrary about, oh, the schools are, people are segregating themselves? I think there's organic segregation, that just sort of happens, like, along socioeconomic lines, whatever. I mean, you might want to look at it and analyze, are there arbitrary obstacles to success that or integration that are keeping people apart? Or is this based on knowledge and decisions of their own? And why is it worrying that a school, as you pointed, there's black schools, white schools, whatever, because of where people are living? And if they're functional, what difference? Why are we worried that someone isn't sitting next to a white kid? And that
yeah,
results in policies like busing and so on. And I've never, in my experience analyzing education, I have never seen a student do better simply because they are sitting next to someone who is a different race.
no,
Never
that's
seen
that's
that.
correct. Yeah, so and again, there's some literature on all these points. I'm not very familiar with this literature on whether kids do better in integrated schools. Again, the impression I get from the whole diversity literature and prepping a paper 3 or 4 years ago, I read pretty much the whole diversity literature. Like it generally breaks down to there's a slight positive or a null effect if everyone's qualified and they like each other. So that's probably the case in integrated schools as well. I happen to know that their sports teams do better just out of sheer curiosity. I looked at that once. And the stereotype there would be you get a white quarterback and a black running back, the tight end might be Polynesian. Like we're having fun with this, but that is what happens actually. And it's obvious to see what the advantage there is. So perhaps there's some similar advantages in the classroom. Asian friend in mathematics or African American friend in theater arts or something. The gap again, all of these advantages are on the order of 2%. Like, I
Right.
mean, a huge amount of how you're going to perform in school is genetic. It comes down to how your parents performed in school. Most of the rest is due to hours of training. This is what the whole hereditarian culturalist debate really centers on. Like, are the gaps between, let's say, whites and blacks, which are small, but which are there, say 10 points right now, 91 to 102, 11 points on the most recent IQ scale, are those large enough that any aspect of them could not be due to training differences, which we know exist and we can track, but
Right.
instead is genetic? So that's a fascinating debate. I'm a culturalist. I don't think so. But just by engaging in that debate, you admit that like 50% of this is genetic, 40% of this is training. So like everything else is in the 10%. Like what the hair color of the teacher is, I mean, it really doesn't probably have that much of an impact, assuming you have smart parents and you've been reading your textbooks. So I mean
Right.
that's my conclusion. It's all in that 5 to 10%. Um, Two quick comments on segregation, though. I mean, obviously, we don't have de jure segregation in the United States. So, virtually every conversation between the smart left and the smart right comes down to semantics to a surprising extent. And this is true in discussions that became quite sensitive, where I never expected that to be true, about everything from free will to sexual assault. You realize that people are using completely different definitional standards for the same thing. So I don't think we have segregation in the USA at all. If you mean de jure breakup of races where people have to work in certain fields, go to school in certain buildings, so on. Similarly, we don't have a caste system.
Mm-mm.
What we do have is what's called residential selection. So, for example, almost all upper middle class Black people would prefer to live in a neighborhood that has some whites. You need the quarterback, but that is 40+% upper middle class Black. And that channels people into schools that often have a similar. Now, this doesn't excuse the hood, which is abandoned. That's all Black. I'm sure the holler in Appalachia the same. But in the majority of suburbs, you'll have a suburb that's stereotyped. I'm thinking of, what is it, Winnetka near Chicago, as heavily South Asian. Perfectly lovely place to live,
It
but
was almost all white when I worked there. That's so
you
funny.
know,
Yeah, I know
tech
it's
guys are
changed
moving
quite a
in.
bit. Yeah, it's changed quite a
But I
bit.
like Skokie, for example, has always been
Skokie,
Jewish
yeah.
American. It still is. Evanston is very heavily college kid, Asian American. So you understand that places have these demographic profiles. Like if you live in Skokie, 35% of your neighbors are going to be Jewish,
Right,
35% of them are going to be Asian American.
right,
So, and that's a tough school probably to be valedictorian in, I would guess,
right,
offhand.
right.
So I don't know if I'd call that residential segregation. The one other thing that's interesting about the seg data, by the way, is that looking very briefly at the sources for your article, it looks like they're doing what people generally do, which is just compare whites and blacks. The issue with that is that it completely removes all of the other groups that have
Yeah,
been moving into the country in recent years. So if you go to California, there are almost no all white or all black schools. Both the white and the black school are going to have a huge mass of kids who are Hispanic, South Asian, Southeast Asian, so on in the building, Arab
right.
American. And so would say that if you just used an analysis of whether the person at the desk next to you was of the same race as you would find that there were very few non-ghetto schools that are segregated by any measure. What the
Right.
way you get that is to compare whites and blacks alone, so that someone who's in a middle class Hispanic and African American suburb would thus technically be going to a segregated school. It has no whites in it. So some data play there. I don't know why you'd automatically assume a Black, Asian, and Hispanic school would be worse if it didn't have whites, but that seems to often be the starting assumption.
Yeah, and the other thing we notice when we look at the data is that white performance has been going down also, so like if in other words, when we look at, performance, it's not like white kids have been doing just as well all along and then everybody else is falling off, or that they've been going up and everyone else is going down. Actually, to your point, you have the Nigerians and Asians. If you really look at disaggregated data and take out the whites who aren't white, what you find is that actual Caucasians are not doing very well at all. In fact, the scores are going down pretty precipitously. And you have these other recent immigrants that aren't even being looked at. So, and I have to wonder about that. But you're right, it's all white, black, white, black. Here we have white, Hispanic, white, Asian, but they're still talking about segregation. And I just I,
Those
I
are
feel
also
like
all broken out separately. So there's no comparison of, like,
no,
if you did Black Hispanic segregation in states where you have both blacks and Hispanics, it would probably be very, very low. Like there'd be a
right,
very high level of intermixture, which led to both
right,
fights and also loving relationships. I would
right,
suspect that Asians would be very intermixed with both whites and blacks as well.
right.
So, in all these groups, just listen to a comedian from a city. They all joke about this, how everyone
Exactly.
behaves on the job site or in the school.
Right.
So, taking those as individual, independent variables and saying, well, whites are separated even from Asians, I'm not sure how useful that is. I mean, you'd want to put something like the segregation index as the dependent variable in a regression model that looks at region, urban status, a bunch of other things, and then you'd want to see what impacted that. I mean, that's a crude idea that just came into my mind, but like just saying that whites and blacks are getting more segregated, I'm not sure what that means. I mean, most Hispanics are Caucasian. So
Right.
Hispanics would not be counted in the whites column there at all.
Right.
I don't know. I'd have to take more of
The
a look
whole
at it,
thing,
but
I just feel like it's so strange to even be having a conversation 70 years after Brown v. Board, how are we doing with segregation? I'm like, well, it's over. I mean, in other words, the point of Brown v. Board of Education and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was to end it. That didn't mean that we were all going to magically, up and disperse like little pixels on a screen into schools evenly. We're still human beings. We're not chess pieces. And it seems like they're getting, why is segregation creeping back up again? The expiration of court orders that mandated school integration. Well, that's another form of force. When they put kids, for example, in Charlestown, Massachusetts, where they started, which was like so solidly white in this early 70s, and they went over to whether it was Jamaica Plain or Roxbury and put the Black kids on a bus, took them away from their neighborhood, sent them over to Charlestown, and vice versa. So people are going to neighborhoods where, as you point out, they don't like each other because you can't just magically change culture overnight. They don't like each other. They aren't near home. They have to sit on a bus. It was a disaster. And to this day, I lived there back in like 2000 to 2005. And it was dangerous. I mean, I felt bad for those kids who were coming from Roxbury and other areas coming into Charlestown to attend that public school. And then what ended up happening is that school emptied out of most of the white kids who were there. They went to Catholic school or they moved or whatever. They just emptied out and became an almost solidly Black school. Can't speak for the school back in their neighborhood, but they were miserable, absolutely miserable in their school because they didn't want to be there. And yet it was the court order putting them there and buses putting them there. And I'm sure some bureaucrat somewhere was going, I've done a good thing. Oh, I'm so important. And I just, as a neighbor, living 2 blocks from the school, I just felt so bad for those kids because you could see it on their faces. I don't want to be here.
Yeah, I mean, busing in general was one of the kind of the great utopian schemes on the left. So, I mean, for example, also in Boston, at one point, the 2 toughest high schools in the city, South Boston High and the Southie Project, which was all white, and actually Roxbury High School, not the feeder school you're describing, were combined. And the something like 60% of all students just dropped out of the school. The idea was that as opposed to go to this building and get in these interracial fights every day, you would simply take your GED course and become a truck driver or something. It was very, very unappealing. But it's a classic example of what Tom Sowell would call an anointed, almost communistic decision by the bureaucratic class. Like, we know that these people need to learn to interact with one another. We know that racism is just foolish and based on false stereotypes. It turns out that's false, actually. Racism is often based on real negative experiences, although it's very awkward to talk about that. And so people who go to prison, for example, where white and Black guys often frankly rape each other or stab each other, are much more likely to come out having fought the Aryan Brotherhood or the Black Guerrilla family as racists.
Mhm.
So, I mean, the assumption was, as I'm saying, utopian. The actual results were that people went to schools where you had a poor white group of students and a Black group of students. Violence was constant. No one liked each other. And the idea that this improved race relations is extremely dubious, to be polite. The comedian Chris Rock actually has a routine about this where he says, he was bused to the Bronx to a poor white school. It was in one of New York's Little Italies. This is true if you look up his history.
Mhm.
And he describes this as, kids from different ethnicities being shipped to other bad schools to practice their fist fighting skills. That was probably the opinion of busing that the average Irish or Italian or Black kid would have had. The problem was that you had this separate Mandarin class that was never going to go to a public school. It was mostly Black or Irish kids that was making these calls, and their kids
Yeah,
were at absolutely no risk.
that's
So,
right.
yeah, I mean, one of the reasons for increased quote unquote segregation, I think it's worth going over 3 terms here. There's, as you know, obviously, but there's segregation, which is forced separation of races.
Right.
There's the sort of busing level integration, which is forced mixing of races. And then there's what I think most parents of pretty much every background support, which is desegregation, where if your kid wants to go to a magnet school and they're good enough to compete or they're an athlete or something, they can
Sure.
look around a city and they can see a number of schools and they can pick one. But
Right.
most other people are going to go to the school in their neighborhood. And
That's
the
right.
school in the Devon Avenue neighborhood in Chicago may be 60% Indian. The school in Bronzeville may be 55% Black and so on. And that's just the way it is. So I mean, following the orders that changed that, where those 2 schools would be bused together, and I believe
Right.
those 2 actually were with predictable consequences, um, you that stopped. So most people are just going to school locally. Last sentence quickly. One of the things I saw just as you scroll through this article, the biggest variable that predicted the increase in segregation, though, is that Caucasian and Black kids are going to different high performing charter schools.
Yes,
Yeah,
the school
they note
choice,
that in passing in the article. Yeah, it's like a page
yeah,
up.
here we go.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
school choice appears to be the dominant force. I mean, I would suspect that many whites are Catholic. Well, that doesn't even apply to charters. But if you're talking about privates, many whites are Catholics, many blacks are Protestants. Probably affects what school you go to. Charters, I mean, they're usually two or three in a city. Even if there's friendly competition, whites pick one, blacks pick one. Who cares? But it's probably more likely that one is located near an African American neighborhood, one's located near a working class white neighborhood. So if you're saying that segregation is caused by people choosing better schools than the public schools, I'm not sure that's a problem at all. So
right,
you have to unpack all of this stuff before you can really come to kind of an activist, very angry conclusion.
right. And then I also think we need to keep asking the question, should we use a different word for people choosing their school and happening to end up in a school that is majority people who look like them versus segregation? Because
Well,
it's so charged, that word.
yeah, in political science, most people say something like residential preference. One of the things that's really interesting about wokeness is that it was always there on campus. I mean, you could always, befriend or ask out some wild haired, clove smoking women's studies major that would tell you about the, heterosexual oppression of the fact that you were going to kiss later and this sort of thing. But it wasn't really taken seriously. I don't know a better way to put that. Like people screaming that Tom Jefferson was a rapist, although that one's at least debatable. Or, William Shakespeare was Abe Lincoln's the worst kind of bigot, is the old cliche dinner party joke. No one believed them until very recently. Like following the rise of social media, we saw a lot of this stuff, which tends to be influential in the upper middle class, concentrated and amplified. And
Right,
that started what we called the Great Awakening, to quote Zach Goldberg, to quote Matt Iglesias. You started seeing mentions of white supremacy and previously fringe ideas increase 1400% in the Times and all that. And I think
right,
that's when you started seeing the resurgence of some of this language. Like people stopped saying residential preference and they started saying segregation. People
right,
stopped saying prison and they started saying the new Jim Crow. All that's post 2010.
right. Well, this is something interesting too. They talk about, there's a popular narrative that segregation has increased because Black students are more likely to attend school with other students who are not white, especially Hispanic students. But Reardon and Owen say this analysis conflates demographic shifts in the US population with segregation. Thank the Lord, someone's bringing this up. I mean, we're constantly told how whites are going to be the minority and so forth. And then, it's rarely brought up again. It's only used almost like a cudgel, to beat people with. But then I'm sitting there thinking, okay, so maybe that would explain why you have more Black students in a school or more brown students in school, because there just simply aren't white people there, in this place, because the demographic is shifting in the United States, and we are America, or say white Americans are what now, 60%? Is it about 60% of the population?
Yeah. I mean, I personally, yes, it's 61%. I personally think all this is kind of silly. Like, for example, I'm classified as 100% Black. I
Right.
mean, genetically, I'd be about 50% Celtic. I mean, just, Hispanics are almost all white. Like, I
That's
argue about this with my
true.
Hispanic friends, and Hispanics have dark skin because the sun's hot in Latin America. But I mean, like, second or third generation Hispanic Americans, especially if they intermarry with white Americans,
Yeah.
the identification rate of those groups with the Caucasian majority is literally between 66 and 90%. The only admixture in the Latino community in Latin America is civilized Indian, which no one really argues has any long-term potential impact on, say, test scoring or something like that. It's just there, Aztec and all that.
Right.
But I mean, it's that, or you're just a white guy. If you're from Argentina, Cuba, many of these countries, Colombia, you're just a white guy. So the whole Hispanic, and I'm not being prejudiced against Hispanics. I like whites fine, but it's
Right.
just the whole Hispanic category was added to the census in 1973, following lobbying from specifically the Mexican American community. And it's remained there ever since. And it's kind of coalesced into this idea that there's a third race in the USA. So prior to
Ah,
that, like,
I see your point. Mm.
yeah, when people say so, there's actually a very important point here. When you debate kind of dissident right types online, one of the things that you always hear is that the USA was 90% white until 1890 or 1940 or whatever. But the point about this is that we just weren't counting Hispanics as anything but white. So we conquered Mexico in the 1840s. There's been a very large Hispanic population, and more, at least
Yeah.
5% of the population, probably more like 15% in Arizona, New Mexico, Tejas, so on down the line. We just correctly assumed those people were mostly white people of Castilian descent. Now, all of those people who are like 10% Indian and 90% white, you can DNA test people these days, identify as some kind of minority rebel. And this is funny to some extent. But when we look at population demographics and we say whites are 60% of the country, you have to remember that Caucasian Hispanics are another 20% of the country.
Mhm.
Multiracial people who are almost all half white are like 5% of the country. And
Mhm.
Asians who are kicking everybody's ass
Mhm.
are about 8% of the country. So, and I don't think anyone dislikes blacks or natives either at this point, but it's not as though like the populations of our teeming slums are, overtaking the country. It's we're bringing in a lot of high quality immigrants from China, Japan, the Philippines, so on, and we reclassified all of our own white people as something else. The
Right.
black population has been stable at 12% basically forever. I mean, going back to the end of slavery, it's been between 12 and 14% of the population.
Yeah. And they're talking now about my district. They're talking about Charlotte Mecklenburg schools. And they are correct that almost all the segregation is because people of different races live in different districts. Well, Charlotte isn't all that different from New York City in the sense that the urban schools, the schools that are sort of like right in or around the center of the city, um, tend to be predominantly black. One of them is really majority black, but all the other three major high schools,
Yeah.
they're just, I would say, 70% minority. I'm not going to say black, but minority. So you'll have Asian, you'll have Hispanic, they're not Caucasian, like European white. And
Mhm.
thinking about, who lives around these schools, I can honestly say that I believe it has more to do with the degree of school choice that we have in the Charlotte Mecklenburg area. And I don't mean school choice like vouchers or ASAs. I'm talking about the sheer number of private schools, the ease of homeschooling here. We at North Carolina has, I think, the highest number of homeschoolers in the country for one state. You also have lots of charter schools, magnet schools that people can lottery into. So I think there are so many when they talked about that school choice, meaning like what parents are choosing to do, they're more often than in other urban districts choosing not to send their child to their neighborhood school because there's another school they'd rather send their child to. And I genuinely think that has more to do with it than even socioeconomic factors. There's only one of the four high schools that I can honestly say is solely because of socioeconomic factors, because that's who lives there. That's who lives in that neighborhood. Beyond that, but they don't
No, I,
really seem to talk about it. They say it's because people don't live in the district. Like that's only half the story.
Well, I think that there's actually a very important point there. So, like, first of all, in a lot of cities like Charlotte, I mean, most of the schools would probably be 40, 60 white minority. Like, you'd see people of every background walking home from school together. That's how it is in Louisville and Frankfurt. I mean,
Sure,
I assume there's some selection effect where more people on the upper end who send their kids to day school would be white or something like that. But I mean, the schools are incredibly integrated. Every time I go to a functional southern city like Louisville, Nashville, something like that, Atlanta, even, no, I
absolutely.
assume there
Mhm.
are also non-functional southern cities like Jackson, Mississippi, where again and I think this gets into my second point though. So many cities manage integration fine. And the prerequisites for that seem to be a functional school system with competent teachers that has some discipline, doesn't privilege white kids, doesn't privilege black kids. You just send your kid walking down the hill to the school. That's what we do in most of Kentucky. It's not going to be an extraordinary school, but I mean, you're going to get home alive. You'll be fine. Um, but I do think that an element, probably 20% of the school segregation debate along with changing population demographics, which is number one. Like, you can't just count all your Hispanics as non-white and say that black people don't go to school, only white people. Many of these schools are 60% Hispanic and Asian. So that's
Yes.
one factor. By the way, we see this all the time. Like with the top prep schools in New York and Chicago, I actually read a bunch of these articles from my upcoming book. We constantly hear that these are very non-diverse schools because they're only 5% black.
They're
They're
going to prep school. They're getting recruited.
Yes, but not only that, the top preps in New York and Chicago, at least if you're talking about the SAT admission schools like Stuyvesant, but also like the NY Latin. I mean, some of the ones we think of as very upper class, they're all like 60% Asian. So you're just not admitting that. You're saying, well, if we look at the white pool of 200 students and the black pool of 40 students, we see underrepresentation of black people. And if you ask, well, what about the Asian and Arab and Nigerian pool? Then all of a sudden there's a weird silence and people like block you on social media. It's very awkward. But so point one, changing demographics, point two, charter schools. But a third point here that's responsible for 10 to 20% of this that we do have to talk about is that racial groups often clash. And at least right now, there is a higher minority crime rate, at least relative to non-poor whites. So, I mean, like when you look at like the Detroit schools, come on. Like, I mean, I saw that graphic, whereas the Detroit schools are about 90% POC, it looks like, and which
Yeah.
is going to be mostly black and 10% white. All those white kids are going to be sort of tough, left behind kids that just live in Detroit. There's nobody in their right mind is going to send their kid to most Detroit public schools. And that's not because of conventional racism in any real sense. Most people wouldn't have that problem in Louisville or Atlanta. It's because of the accurate perception that there's going to be a very high rate of crime and disorder in those schools. So that's something that no one likes to talk about. Like the idea that much of white flight and middle class black flight in the 1960s and 70s wasn't irrational.
That's
Stuff
right.
like blockbusting was despicable, so on. But in cities like Cleveland, cities like the Kentucky cities, where that didn't really happen to a massive degree, Detroit, in fact, where you'd had integration for a pretty significant period of time. Detroit was one of the best integrated cities in the country. We're talking about a northern city, huge black business class, blacks and whites had owned enterprises together since the 30s. What you had was an incredible increase in crime in the 60s when we started liberalizing the criminal justice system. And also just big ass riots every year. Like, excuse the description, but 63, 64, 68. I mean, the downtown was burnt down once. Parts of the city look like bombs hit them. So when you're talking about this, that's obviously going to influence who sends their kids where.
Sure.
So parents that have options, which is going to include proportionately more white parents, don't want to send their kids to failing inner city schools. And I think, like, I'm a black leader, quote unquote. Like, I'm a black guy who has some local power position, works at the local college, has been an executive in the area, so on. And I've looked at some of these things that are centered on questions of how can we improve the local schools and so on. And I think my suggestions have always been pretty practical, like hire better teachers. And when you say stuff like that, there's often almost a sigh of relief from everyone in the room, which would include African Americans, poor whites, bluntly, well off people in the business community to think about where to send their kids. Because the idea is, okay, well, at least in this mid sized city, we're just going to make these keep working,
Right.
keep functioning. The issues that you have in a Detroit or a New York or something center around the fact that you're implementing all these policies that don't work. Like, so for example, you're getting rid of the entry boards for teachers, not to just yammer on and on about this, but you're getting rid of the boards for teachers because they're racist. What that means in practice is that you're going to hire a bunch of incompetent teachers, only half of whom are minorities, by the way. A bunch of them are just like young white people, men who got out of the army and young women who want to be teachers and so on.
Right.
Um, and if you have that quality of teacher and then you pull back on discipline, you're going to have a lot of violence in the schools. We saw that a situation in Missouri recently where a kid got her head beaten in on the concrete, and people treated this as sort of the racial abuse of a white kid. Not really. It turned out the kids consented to fight, and that happened during a fight where 100 other people were fighting.
That's
But
right.
that kind of doesn't matter. And I'm going to end this here. If your school regularly has 100-person brawls between black and quote unquote redneck kids where people get killed, you're probably going to avoid that school. And that's a big problem in working class districts. And so it's more of a problem for black people and other minorities.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I would love it if we could deal with the problems that we can clearly see rather than trying to hypothesize one output of it. So it's, like,
Really good point.
"Oh, look at this. There are only, a few white people going to the school. That's a problem." Like, no, back up. Why is that? And
Yes.
don't focus on what they look like, focus on why anyone doesn't want to go to your school, because probably a lot of people who are there don't want to be there either. They just don't have another option.
I
So
actually want to jump in there because that's a really good point that I rarely hear sort of like white business and academic class people bluntly make. Like, when you see a school that has virtually no white kids in it, one of the questions to ask is why? I mean, like most people today, black and white, are obviously not racists. I mean, it's like the evidence is so sweeping, it's hard to settle on one thing to present. But for both African Americans and whites, approval of interracial dating is at 96%, and that's a quarter of new marriages. So, like, just most people clearly aren't bigots. Like the white quarterback I joked about earlier would probably be very cool going to the black school and taking even easier courses and picking up some new receivers. Like you can joke about it, but like there's no practical problem that that person would have with doing that. The issue is going to come in at the parental level, or the issue is going to come in at the level of individual judgment about something other than academics and athletics. Like, is it safe to get there? So, I mean, when you see a school that has almost no varsity athlete looking white people in it, that's a sign that there's probably something that's kind of risky going on there. And
right,
very often when you unpack the data, you can simply see that that's the case. I mean,
exactly.
looking at that school in Missouri, which actually is somewhat integrated, but heavily majority black, I mean, you can look at the number of incidents, crimes, and so on that occur on or near the campus, that kind of thing. And you're right. Like, it's not just white people. No parents with options are going to send their kids to school where 100-person brawls break out on anything like a regular basis. If that's happening more at minority schools, just like 70 years ago, it happened more at Irish and Italian schools, we
Hmm.
need to look at what's going on, stop making excuses, hire security, expel kids, fire the teachers that allowed that. The problem with all this woke stuff is that it directly interferes with that.
It
The
does.
woke idea the woke idea, which you've explained quite well on Twitter, sometimes to rather hysterical response, but the woke idea is basically the cause of everything is oppression. And it's weird to me that this goes beyond race. Like I'm actually fairly feminist myself on a few topics, but I debated a lot of fourth wave feminist activists for the past week. And I noticed that they were doing this too. Like everything is the fault of the external pressure. So, for example, if women are more likely to support trans participation in female sports than men are, and this is a dramatic difference, you're talking about like 78 to 29%, this sort of thing. The reason is that men are making them feel that way. Guys are subtly gaslighting them. We know we want women in their place, and who even wants to talk about what that would be, like all this sort of stuff. And the reality is that no, like most male former athletes or soldiers or business people, in fact, like women quite well, and don't think that 6'5" males should play girls volleyball. This is a problem you guys seem to be having.
Right.
Similarly, when we look at black crime, that's a problem that didn't exist at the same level 50 or 60 years ago.
Hmm.
Black people skyrocketed past all the ethnic white groups I mentioned to the point where we now commit half the murders in the country. So
Right.
I don't really see a reason to come up with some esoteric way to blame white people for that. We could just
Right.
start arresting murderers in black communities and take off the stop snitching t-shirts. This is a very unpopular position, but it's also an obviously correct one.
I would agree. And if you really want to dig into, you know, what makes some people leave versus other people, then look at their opportunity to leave. And we know there are more single parents, single mothers in particular in, black households, and it might be harder for them to just pick up and get their kid to another district. There's a single income coming into that house. And, all of these things add up. But instead of looking at them and saying, hey, let's peel back the layers and look at beyond race at how do people make choices? Why do they limit themselves? I mean, I doubt the average black parent in a terrible school is going, yeah, that's good enough. You know, they probably would love to leave. And then you have to look at why can't they? Well, it's probably not some other person holding them back. It's something about their life, their life, their income, their choices, et cetera. And this is not to blame. I'm just making an observation that you need to have certain opportunities or the ability to pick up and move or the ability to identify another school, et cetera. And instead, it's all about white flight. And that's what I think is, we look at too few variables consistently. And that's, again, the non statistician talking. So the next article was tracing black and white achievement gaps since the Brown decision. And this, similarly, they talk about data showed considerable progress in integrating schools, but step backwards since the 90s, et cetera, troubling shift. Then we get down to this data of the average reading scores. And this is what I was talking about. You see how the white scores are going down too?
Yeah. Now, one thing I would say about this data from the NAEP in this article, especially, let me look at it, especially the math data for 9-year-olds, where the score for blacks in 2004, 2024, is
Mhm.
the same as the score for whites in the 80s, which is exactly 2024, 1982. It's 2027, 1986. So, I mean, this to me, like when I say that I'm basically a culturalist on this stuff, what I mean is that IQ scores are not set in stone. And the NAEP obviously is basically an IQ test. IQ scores aren't set in stone in some unchangeable, inflexible way. Like when we're looking at these average math scores for 9-year-olds on the long term trend on NAEP, National Assessment of Educational Progress, I mean, literally the score in 1982, 4 years along the top trend line, is going to be 224, and so is the score for black people, at it looks like 2004. Yeah, they're
Mhm.
identical. So, I mean, there've been a number of cases where black training has improved to the point that blacks caught whites, at least of the previous generation. So, I mean, this
Yes.
this is one of those points that we sometimes we keep treating this like this can't be done. This is actually done all the time. Like black people that come to the United States from frankly second world countries. I don't know if they're third anymore, but the Caribbean, Nigeria, South Africa, I mean, do as well as white Americans.
Well, then
And
to
the
your
American
point too,
immigration process is not a selective process.
at what point, you mentioned it earlier, now I've forgotten. When did we start counting Asians and Hispanics as white people?
Well, we don't
Not
normally count the
Hispanics, but oh, so we
well,
don't
we don't
literally do that. They do disaggregate them from
Well,
this data?
actually, I wrote an article for Spiked where sometimes we do count Asians as white people, but we would rarely count Asian Americans in the white column. What you'd normally
I
see is
see.
something
Yep.
like if you're going to do that, like POC and not POC.
I see. I got you.
Yeah,
So this is truly just
that's
Caucasian,
probably black
European.
versus white. Yeah,
Got it. Okay. But I think
but
it's
yeah,
still an excellent point that here these numbers are identical, which shows that they can be achieved. And then we see the decline being
yeah, for
along a
both groups.
similar trajectory. This is a little steeper, but both went down, which tells you that something is amiss in the schools. This is probably not a racial issue. They were starting at a lower point, so obviously their drop is going to be lower. But what's happening? This as a teacher, I'm like, what's going on in the schools that this is happening? Now you could say COVID, you could say a lot of different things. I have other theories. I don't think it's exclusively COVID. Because we're talking about 9-year-olds here. So, they were barely even in school.
I
Um,
Well, I think that's the issue, though. I mean, I would say it wasn't COVID per se, but the hysterical COVID response, where in
yeah,
every middle class on up community, I mean, every kid stayed home for 3 years. I like if you actually look at the 2024 data from the PISA, which has already come in, the NAEP's not in, but I mean, you see that loss for blacks and whites has basically reversed itself. I mean, what that indicates to me again is I don't want to keep beating this like culturalist hobby horse here, but there's this consistent argument that gaps in performance between groups need to be due to either genetics, basically. That's what Dr. Kendi's talking about when he talks about like the hidden rumor of inferiority of the black man and all this stuff, or to just pure racism. And what we see is that that's obviously not true. Like during the period between like 1976 and 2000, the high black score on that chart, which was as good as the white score, came from 2004. That's a different chart, but yeah, that's still a high black score. Yeah, good.
yeah,
Okay, so 13-year-olds also did pretty well on that. Um, whites did better though. Shout to whites, they did well too. But I mean, so those high scores came from a period when people were relatively equal, but we weren't making a lot of crazy excuses yet. Like, I'm
that's
not
true.
surprised. Yeah, I'm not surprised at all that this peaked in 2004. Like 2004 is before social media. It's before kind of the new Ferrere techniques in education had really gotten down into the secondary level schools.
True.
Um, It's just before a lot of things happen. So when you go through social media and phones, you go through wokeness, you go through COVID just shutting down the damn schools, all of that, you start seeing a drop again. And at least for blacks, I mean, the drop at the end of that is pretty close to where black people were in 1985. But the
True.
problem is that there's this tendency to attribute that to kind of that old devil racism. Excuse me. And that doesn't empirically make any sense at all. Like no one thinks there's more racism today than there was in 1978. Even though there wasn't much then, it's just that's not real.
I mean, I'd
So
love to tell you nobody thinks that, but yet I actually meet people in person, not many, but the occasional person, and usually it is somebody who works in education who genuinely believes that, or they're under the age of 30. So it's not nobody over the age of 30 really believes that. Nobody who lived through, and it's certainly no one over the age of 40 believes that, who isn't hardcore to the left and lying. But younger people who didn't live it and don't, they've just been told this is terrible, they believe it. And if they're teachers, like little elementary school teachers are 25 years old and they've grown up with the whole St. Floyd and all this, they will look at these figures and say, you see, there it is. The proof that systemic racism is real and it's getting worse.
yeah, but there's actually a very easy way to check that, which is just using an objective measure of what you could call systemic racism. So, I mean, the one that I provided earlier was just what's your willingness to, as yourself, or
Right.
to see this from a very close friend or your sister, to engage
Mm.
in, say, interracial marriage.
Yes.
And I think that's a pretty good proxy. Like if you're willing to have to lovingly sleep with someone of a different race or fight beside them in the army, like at a certain level, you can't be racist. Like it becomes accurate to say, no, this person is not an extreme racial
Right.
bigot. And she spends all day thinking lovingly about her black husband. So I mean, like we're moving into the nonsense zone with a lot of this, but no, I think that classic, bar room or country club impression is correct. Um,
Right.
so, but if you take that objective metric of external racism, like are people willing to date, marry, love people of another race, serve under them in the military, vote for them, work for them, racism's declined probably. It's about a third of what it was even in the tolerant 1970s. So
Right.
there's actually no trend line where it makes sense that scores would drop to where they were in 78 and racism is the causal variable that explains that. What's probably the causal variable that explains that is actually anti-racism. We've specifically stopped training black people. Now, and part as part of patronizing black people, and this is one of the reasons I don't support this. I think it's going to boost racial tensions overall, is competitive white and Asian and so on moms just get furious looking at the nonsensical Sumerian math kids are doing and so on. But as part of patronizing black people, we've kind of stopped training everybody.
Yes.
Like how do you add 8 plus 5 using a base of 10, as though you were Moses? Like the idea is that basic things that we've developed over the past several thousand years can't be taught to these kids. Um, but obviously all of that has impacted knowledge. I guess that's basically my point. Like the variable of racism is probably almost totally irrelevant when compared to other things in those models that we're looking at.
And
But
if you want to resuscitate racism, which, people in power might want to do for, division, divide and conquer purposes, yeah, it's pretty easy to do, especially with children because they don't know any better. But I do think it has disastrous effects on their achievement because whether it's I don't want to achieve because then it's acting white, or I don't want to learn the white man's literature, or, math is racist, or some other garbage that they're pushing into the schools, you're going to end up with low objective score. You're going to look, that those metrics. And now we see people saying, let's throw out the tests altogether. So we can't even tell what's happening. So first, the achievement gap is so important. We have to look at it constantly and dissect it to serve this narrative. And then now it's like, nope, let's stop looking. Let's stop testing. Let's not look anymore. Well, why? Whose interest does that serve? We need this, as to your point, we need to have some way to see how the students are doing because there is such a difference in quality of teaching. And it's really the only way you can know. That's your only objective measurement is like, is this working?
yeah, no, I think that's basically correct. I mean, my actual suggestion for how to educate black kids or poor white kids or anyone else would be just treat them like everybody else.
Right.
Like, you might find that there is an unchangeable cultural or even very small, purely genetic, although I don't think so, but component to these gaps. But the reality is that if you just make everyone suffer and learn the same mathematics and so on, you're going to have the smallest possible gaps there, I would guess. I noticed that the black-white gap intensified the most when you weren't teaching anything and people were just sitting at home. Because the poorer you are, the more reliant you are on those intense real lessons in school. Like, you're
True.
not going to go home to the projects or the trailer park and have your mom play brain games with you or log online with your friends to play Kahoot or something like that. You're just going to go outside and, catch the football. Like, there's nothing
Right.
wrong with that. But the best way to close these gaps would be to very intensively train everyone, preferably in tracked education, so people are learning at somewhat similar paces, and then at the end see how people do. And you might still have a 6% black white gap, but then
Right.
you just kind of live with that and move forward.
Right.
And I guess one of the things that is interesting to me about this is that I've never seen why this is an enormous problem in the first place.
I
I mean,
agree.
yeah, these, I mean, so there's a, what is it, 7% if you look at 102 to 108, 109. I mean, there's a similar IQ gap or a similar test score gap between whites and Asians.
Right.
I mean, there's a women slaughter men on the verbal boards. Like, it's 80 points ahead. Men are about 50 better in math. Men are also twice as big as women. I mean, there are all kind of differences in society,
Right.
and twice as dumb at the left tail of the curve if you look
We
at
we
representation among criminals.
we
Just
treat
many math.
equality like like the holy grail, and I always want to question it, like, why is parity a worthy goal? I
Yes.
want an answer. I mean, I don't want people to just say just cuz, like, if we remove arbitrary obstacles and we remove, so we can, reliably say there's nothing holding you back, and now it's just you're at the same starting line, go. Why do we get so worked up if two different people, and they're different in any which way, male versus female, race, socioeconomic, whatever, if they don't end up in the same place, why do we care so much? And I don't ever really get a good answer.
Yeah, I'm not sure why we care either. And this gets into the whole idea of equality versus equity, actually. So I think
Yeah.
everyone supports rough equality. I mean, in the sense that, yeah, there should be no barriers for
Right.
anyone anywhere that are at least state created or business created. I mean,
Right.
obviously it was a barrier to my desire to play in the NBA that I'm 5'10". I
Or
mean, like, it's
mine.
just, yeah, of course, yeah, you're 5'8" headed female or whatever.
Right,
If
right.
I don't know the
Yeah, like
exact
5 foot
height.
nothing, basically.
Really?
I'm not going anywhere.
That's an even bigger, bigger issue.
But
You're
I could
playing
be
like
a coxswain on a crew team.
true. The ideal role for the diminutive jock. But
Exactly.
the whole idea there, though, like, there, of course those barriers exist in life. I mean, when I mentioned that, IQ is probably 55 to 80% genetic, that's a consensus in my field. There are things that just are that can't be changed by anyone that aren't fair. I mean, even the training component of that, which is substantial, it's up to 45%. But I mean, I'm sure there's some genetic predictor of that, how competitive you are or something like that. So you can control your life to some extent. You obviously have free will. You can do a lot in that 45% space. The group gaps we're talking about are on the order of 10 points. But life can't ever be fair.
Right.
However, when we talk about equality, I think what we're saying is that the entity that you're working with, the state or whatnot, hasn't created any additional barriers to crash you up. There are no laws that say women can't do any job in the country. And I support that. And I think by this point, almost everyone supports that for men, women, blacks, whites. The question with equity is a little different. It's, do you have proportional representation regardless of performance? And I think that the answer obviously has to be no. Like, I'm thinking of the old Kentucky gentleman's line, the business of business is business. Like, if you're doing something, if you're selling horses, your business is selling horses. You need to move a certain number of horses out of the door of the stable every year. Pretending that other things are as important as the thing for which you exist or the thing you exist to do is foolish. And I think that diversity, like Christianity and so on in the past, occasionally did, at least, and those were more noble causes, but has kind of reached that level where people have to pretend that this is the key goal of their enterprise, and it's just not.
Right.
So, I mean, actually achieving equity among, say, Marine snipers would have all kinds of negative effects. Even if you're just talking about women or minorities, a certain number of people would die because the very best candidates wouldn't be there. But I mean, what if you're talking about, as American Airlines currently is for pilots, including the blind? Like, you could take this to an absurd level. That's not a joke, by the way.
Okay.
But you could take this to an absurd level and
You
destroy
have to have 20
society.
vision to fly in the military.
Yeah, well, let me pull this up because this is actually not something I'm kidding about. A disabled pilots hiring program.
Oh my God.
Disabled pilots hiring program.
Blind. Yeah,
I'm
I
sure
don't
there's
think
going to
so.
be some. No, I don't want to do some of that Twitter level content where I'm saying that they are going to hire a bunch of blind pilots. But yeah, okay. Turbo News. This is one of the leading aeronautics journals. The FAA seeks pilots and air traffic controllers with disabilities. Major airlines concur. So, as part of the FAA DEIA program, candidates with disabilities are currently going through a streamlined hiring process without having to compete with more able applicants. Um, There's a strong focus on recruiting individuals with specific disabilities. And again, this is the latest Turbo. They're
Right,
reviewing the
right.
FAA's new program. The FAA website states that there's a strong focus on recruiting individuals with specific disabilities such as hearing or vision impairments, missing limbs, paralysis,
I
partial or
can't.
complete,
Missing
epilepsy,
limbs.
severe intellectual disability, psychiatric disability, and dwarfism. So, I mean, there's no one of the things that it took me a while to realize is that there's no inherent stopping point for this. Like, I was a big advocate for gay rights. I was actually a
Right.
canvas manager for the Human Rights Campaign in the late OOs. And it struck me, I thought this was going to be kind of the last of the Crusades.
Yeah.
So there was a long time when ethnic whites didn't have any rights. I still have an old "No Irish Need Apply" sign. Irishmen got rights, and emphasis on the men there. And then black men got rights. And then you saw the first couple of genuinely admirable waves of feminism. Women got most rights, and then their gays were campaigning for rights. And it at the time it was just sort of like, okay, this is the last one, right? These guys, they like to have sex with guys. My opinion on that, not for necessarily public viewing in terms of how appealing I find it, but you have a perfect right to do that.
Right, sure.
And I think it's horrible you guys are being discriminated against. So, like, my friends and I actually went and marched, and we went and stood around the hood and signed up voters and collected money and got in fights with people. It was very civil rights-ish.
Right,
And
right.
then in 2012, when we won, I still remember the Pride event in Chicago when Obergefell passed. Like, the sound of the people getting their freedom, like hundreds of thousands of people dancing. It was really quite beautiful. But then the next year, I got a fundraising appeal from the same group, the Human Rights Campaign, that said, "Are you ready for the Trans Rights Campaign?"
Oh
And
my God.
it was just sort of like, okay, now this is becoming that bullshit. Like, is there no stopping point for any of you guys? And by
Right.
this point, the NAACP had started hitting me up for money as a black businessman. And you realize that this is going on and on, but you realize that there's no inherent point where everyone will feel that rough equality has been reached. I mean, beyond the trans community, we now have the MAP community. Alongside them, although by no means to be compared with them, you have the blind people who want to be pilots. You have the neurodivergent community, which is now 30% of all white women who also want to be oppressed, and just on and on and on. And so at some point, you have to say, no, we don't need blind, 4 foot tall pilots with dogs in the cockpit. No, it doesn't make any sense. We need the best people because everyone falls into 100 categories that could potentially be oppressed. I'm from the lower class. I'm in a relationship with a member of the LGBT community, although I'm defining that very broadly. I am, I'm black, I'm native, Irish, threefold oppression there. The fact that I'm some plump academic who normally walks around in a suit, that could easily be presented as totally irrelevant. So there's no stopping point for this.
Right. And I just I wish the legacy of something like Brown v. Board of Education were taught as, yay, we threw off the yoke of state arbitrary rules mandating things on the basis of race. Let's not do that again. So, like that should be what we're looking at. 70 years later, we should be looking at everything that you just said about anti-racism and DEI and saying, wait a minute, no. Remember, we had to go to the Supreme Court and say that there shouldn't be these kinds of things where it's like, you can't go over here because you don't look like this, and only people who did. And yet this is just the flip side of the same coin. And to me, that is a failure of progress. If we had really progressed since then, we would have stopped it, as you said, like 2012, or
Mhm.
maybe before that, it was just that, and just be like, we're done now. Can we stop? And unfortunately, to your point, we're still going. So to round it up, what do you want to tell the audience about your book? Because I know um, you've got a couple books, but the latest book, why should we read it? Because I know I'm going to read
Well,
it.
okay, well, thank you. I'm glad to have. I can send you a copy. Actually, I think I agreed to do that on Twitter,
Yes,
so I'm
you
going to be
did.
mailing them out today. Having my assistant do it. He says like a boss, but I'm
Yeah.
actually signing them. So we have all these in the front of my house right now. But the next book is called Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me. And the book, it has a witty title and all that. And I think the chapters are fun and engaging to read, but it makes a very serious point, which is that for a very long time in America, we've been kind of told two things. In massively best-selling books, like the original Lies My Teacher Told Me, the 1619 Project's History of America, Bury My Heart It Wounded Me, A Native History of America, Howard Zinn, that old commies, A People's History of America, so on
Yes.
down the line. So the pitch is kind of one, two. One, your country is evil. Your whole society is evil. Westerners, whites, preppy blacks, Asians, all these people can't be not to be trusted. But part two is, and you've never heard that before. You are a member of kind of the dark elect that went to Bowdoin or Yale or wherever, because now you're hearing this message. You know the truth, and you can go forth and reform society using, the deep tools you've learned, which is just a bunch of warmed over Marxism and, activist rhetoric from the 60s. So the point that I make in this book is one, our society is not uniquely bad. In fact, if anything, we're probably uniquely good. I take a look at slavery around the world. Slave was one of the first 10 human words. So the Sumerian glyph for man from the mountains actually became their word for slave after about 10 wars. They literally drew a shackle over it, if I recall correctly. So they won, and then slave means defeated warrior. It's one of the first concepts humans ever thought of. Interestingly enough, by the way, I don't want to go on a sideline here, but there's a lot to be said about human personality from actually going back to those hieroglyphic languages and seeing what words mean. So, like the Chinese word for opportunity means like luck, dark humor, and a sword. And I mean, you tend to suspect how the first
That's
Chinese king
hilarious,
got,
actually.
yeah, very close to that. Slave is defeated warrior. There seem to be three human symbols. There's the open hand for peace, symbol for sexual intercourse that I won't make, and then the slit throat for total war. So, I mean, that was absolutely fascinating. Those are probably the first three things that humans cared enough about to communicate with one another. I would like to sleep with you. I'm going to kill you. And hey, man, let's trade. Um, the hieroglyphs are not very far above that. I forget what culture it was, but the symbol for marriage in one culture is literally the trading of money for love. It's like woman's warm heart bag of gold. So you get back to the original idea, and the idea that human relationships involve trading not so much just sex, but domesticity and civilization, perhaps on the
Sure.
one hand, for resources and protection on the other hand, is obviously true. But it's just one of those things that's a bit tacky to say to your girlfriend. So it's kind of funny to look back at these ancient languages and say, oh, like they were very honest about that. I'm
Yeah.
not sure that symbol's a heart, in fact. It's just they're but anyway, so the that is something. So getting back to the point, though, we've heard that our society is uniquely evil. We've heard that you're among the first to ever hear this. In fact, the exact reverse is the case. Our society, if anything, is unusually good, and that has been almost intentionally disguised by educators, media members, so on down the line for decades now.
Right.
And
Right.
that decades now point, I think, is one that's very important. I mean, when we talk about segregation, Brown v. Board, which completely ended de jure segregation, implementation took another decade, but which made that illegal at the Supreme Court level, happened in 1954. The Civil Rights Act, which completely, any racial discrimination is civilly and often criminally illegal. That was 1964. Pro minority affirmative action has been in place since 1967, if you date that to the Philadelphia Plan under Mr. Nixon. So when people say, well, we had 100 years of slavery, 1776 to 1865, we've had almost as many years of responsive anti-racism. And it is about time to start critically looking at that and saying, well, what did this produce? What was it a positive? Are we seeing the term that comes to my mind immediately, of course, is ROI? Are we seeing ROI from that? I would say no. But at any rate, the book unpacks all of this. And it looks specifically at 10 claims that you hear a lot in popular media and in academic literature. Slavery was unique to the West, or at least worse in the West. One of my favorites, the Red Scare, was kind of a scam. It was an illusion drummed up by bums like Joe McCarthy, caught no communists. Native Americans were peaceful and spent all day dancing. And, I mean, like, it just all of
Protecting
this.
the land. Yes.
Well, do I have the book with me? Like, there's a hilarious passage of, around how, let's see, don't want to waste a ton of time here, but if we can get to page 47 inside a minute, this might be worth doing. Where's the thing about Native Americans? So, the US government has a formal Native American Indian curriculum. Can I read you some of this?
Sure, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, I mean, it's just hilariously funny. Like, and this is the US Department of Agriculture. This goes out to several 100,000 people every year, at least 1,000 schools. Okay, while people of today have just begun to think about this, indigenous Americans always had a profound love and respect for the natural world. There was love of every form of life. The Native Americans did not kill anything they could not use. They never killed an animal or a fish or a foe man for the sport of it. Then I say higher forms of ecology were apparently also practiced. Across all or almost all tribes, natives lived in harmony with nature and did not abuse the natural world. Native Americans were ecologists long before the world was ever used.
Oh
Um,
my God.
and this just goes on and on. Like they claim there was a native value system, which they apparently came up with by interviewing old tribal chiefs over drinks, not even making this up. But so some of the more
Wow.
notable components of this alleged epistemology, this is me talking, are respect for your fellow man, in quotes, no prejudice, no major wars ever, in quotes, no Indian nation destroyed another. There were thousands of years of peace before 1492. No poor and no rich, no jails, taxes, borders, or boundaries limiting the migration or potential of people in any way. Now, course, if you went
Wow.
to the paramount chief of the Iroquois, who were a nation of hundreds of thousands that fought the whites for 200 years instead of this, he'd have you killed, just like any other king would. But people really believe this. And this kind of nonsense is incredibly prevalent in our society. So,
I
I mean, I think it's worth pointing that out. And I think the book does a pretty good job of pointing that out.
Well, I'm really excited to read it actually because I love that type of thing. I love that type of like debunking where it's like, well, people believe this, but let me show you what's actually true. So I'm excited about it. And everybody watching and listening, you should get a copy of this book. I'm really grateful to you for coming here and sharing your wisdom with us because this is a hot topic now. The whole like, we're resegregating the schools. No, schools are still segregated, blah, blah, blah. So next time, listeners, if you hear the word or see the word segregation, think about what we said here. What do they mean? What are they talking about? And then as far as the achievement gaps, same thing. Think about other factors and variables that maybe there are not being presented to you before you decide, oh no, it's racism, or we know what the answer is. Because I don't think we do. We're not really asking enough questions, in my opinion. So, any final thoughts?
No, I think, well, actually, I do have one quick final thought. I would encourage people to remember that there aren't any good or bad guys in the sense of groups that are always heroes or villains. I mean, it's a silly childlike way to look at conflict. I mean, we may fight the Arabs again in the near future. They're an honorable, civilized people. So are we. We just have some disputes. I mean, so that's the case. And I mean, that's Hamas is challenging that right now. But I mean, like in general, there are very few, and I'm actually making an America specific point here. When
Right.
you look at whites or blacks or men or something like that, Hispanics, there are few, if any, groups that are consistently bad. Most people are just people.
Right.
What is bad is systems that follow certain forms, I guess. So, like, formalized government mandated racial non integration is bad. It's led to countless wars over the years and so on. So, if someone starts arguing for a system that has always failed, like communism or like formalized segregation, and their argument is generally going to be, well, we need that to stop the bad guys, the bad people. Otherwise, the whites will pull their children. My comment there would be just remember that there very probably aren't any bad guys there. The system will still be bad even if the good guys are running it. And that's something to keep in mind. That's the real reason the end often doesn't justify the means. You only get the end about half the time against a skilled opponent. You've still done all of the means. So if you
Yep.
try to implement communism and it fails, it would have sucked even had it succeeded. But in fact, you're just administering a ruined country, as the Venezuelans are now. So much the same
Right.
thing in the educational system. Destroying it to try to save it from white people or whatever is a bad idea.
Exactly. Well, wonderful way to end that. So thank you so much. Well, I really appreciate it. Again, please like, share, comment. We'd love to hear what people have to say about this topic. I'm always interested to hear what people have to say about these ideas. If you learned something, let us know. And we'll see you again next time. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you.